Okay, now we hope that today's webinar is providing you with some good food for thoughts, because it will be a very practical webinar, and that the overall learning outcome will be for you to know how to identify and build on current best practices as identified in the set of excerpts that we will go through, and more specifically for you to understand the difference in between summarizing and reporting versus engaging in critical analysis, to assess where you are in your writing and your critical engagement with the literature, which is something you can, as a matter of fact, check very objectively for yourself. Thirdly, to understand that there will be old and less skilled writing sitting next to new and shiny writing, including in your very own thesis. So if you look into the theses that are published, you will have old writing that is perhaps 1, 2, 3, 4 years older than final writing sitting next to each other. And understanding what is new and what is old can help you yourself to learn what is best practice to follow and what might be avoided. Fourth, to learn how to read the literature with a problem, but not a solution focus. And fifth, practice how to draw and compare on evidence and data and not only on conclusions. And then understand how to critically reflect on and how to challenge conclusions that are put forward in the literature. And then we will, towards the closing, look into some training offers that we do have and have the group discussion where we have a space for reflections, questions, and a webinar wrap up. So today, the webinar will be very practical. It will take advantage of both unpublished writings and works available from publicly thesis repositories. And we will look into those. And so to understand current best practice, also next to as what potentially could be improved further. And hopefully this should provide you with the ability to critically assess the quality of the work of others and to understand what to follow and what not to. Now with this, let's go into the first part to understand the difference in between summarizing and reporting, which is usually the easy part, versus critical analysis, which is what is to be trained throughout the doctorate. As a colleague of mine says, doctoral students are often told by their supervisors that their work needs to move from description to analysis. But what does this mean? Have you just wasted your time doing all that describing? Well, in short, no. The good news is that most analysis, whether it is of numbers, words, or images, starts with description. Now, the point in here is that most of the initial readings, but also most of the readings that you're doing through the thesis journey, are first and foremost for you and yourself to get knowledge, to understand what the subjects are about, to have an idea about related research that had been carried out, to understand the wider research field and the related fields. And all of that necessarily has a descriptive and summarizing nature, because it is meant, the purpose is for you to get a better understanding. Only once you do have that and turn towards focusing on the research questions and research problem, you start to compare the one with the other, and only at that point in time where you start to compare, you move from summarizing and reporting towards a critical analysis. Now, and as a very practical example, let's look here in the above, the initial writing, definition setting your narrative, so you tell others and yourself what is defined as. So in this case, the starting point to define behavior is where the student is defining individual behavior. Going like behavior is a commonly used concept, even though the definition of the concept of behavior itself is not a clearly established one. This section aims to provide a work definition of the concept of behavior to serve as a working base for this research in accordance to the Oxford Dictionary. Now, if you just take that in accordance to the Oxford Dictionary, this is a clear indicator for this being initial work. Why? Because you're working over dictionaries. If you're moving towards more advanced writing, then definitions will be within your narrative, but not any longer the narrative. So if we look at the lower part, the term learning material could be defined as any entity containing a chunk of information useful for somebody to develop knowledge in a certain context. It could be a book, a URL, an instruction, an observation, a peer. This definition is suitable for formal education and free open source software as it is broadly expressed. Now, first of all, in the second example, you are outlining what it could be consisting of, what could be learning materials. So you take a position and then you say what for this is suitable. So you move already one step further. So this is still a very much initial writing, but you already made the move from having definitions setting your narrative towards moving into having definitions within your narrative. So this might be the second step from the analysis process. Now, another thing that you often see in initial writing is that the messenger is setting the narrative and not the message is setting the narrative. So what does that mean? Let's look into the above case. Author A was saying that apples are good. Author B said, however, too many apples in a given day are not good. Therefore, both authors disagreed on whether or not apples are good. Now, obviously, this is an example that had been made up, but the point in here is that you compare what author A says against what author B says. Now, in advanced writing, the author almost always will move out of the narrative. And that is what you can see in the second part below, where you have, in addition to this, there might also be economic barriers, such as required initial investments or the capability and willingness to invest. You have the resource mentioned that can play a crucial role in this and act as a distinctive to adopt more energy efficient behaviors. Again, reference with regards to these, there also appears to be a preference of short-term gains compared to long-term ones, as well as a preference for action when these create potential gains rather than taking action to avoid potential losses. For example, one might prefer to refurbish the kitchen that results in immediate benefits rather than to exchange the boiler for more energy. So you see, you're not naming the messenger, but you focus really on the message. In this case, you're looking at economic barriers and you compare different points that you observed from different literature sources. So you're only using the literature to support you in your argument. So this is already one step further towards advanced writing. Descriptive writing, first and foremost, is very, very quickly. You can compile hundreds of pages in a day. Now, this is what makes the descriptive writing distinctly different from critical analytical writing, where it can take a day or two to write a single A4 page. Now, let's, for example, look, states what happens. This is a process. And you see this all over again, that if you describe a process, that is very quickly, because you just need to write down your observations. I was standing up. I was going to the bathroom. I was brushing my teeth. I was picking up my clothes. So you just describe a process. Now, if you work over critical analytical writing, then first of all, you would need to establish an object of analysis, like what has been my biggest challenge today. And then you need to identify the units of analysis, the morning, entering the bathroom, afterwards entering into the sleeping room, getting ready to be dressed. So you identify units of analysis, and based on that units of analysis, you then start to evaluate the significance. So whenever you write quickly, that's a good indicator for being descriptive in nature. While whenever it feels painful, then likelihood is great, you're moving rather towards critical analytical writing. Now, are there any questions up to this point?
Yeah, so far so good, thank you.
Very well. So let's move into the second part then. Assess where you are in your writing and your level of critical engagement with the literature. Now, how can you assess if you are still just summarizing and reporting. As said, writing is easy, it is quick, it is generic, it lacks evidence, and it lacks references. And this here is an example of an early writing. This definition suggests that human behavior refers to how someone reacts or behaves upon a situation, changing from person to person. So how such a definition can be applied, the term behavior might be understood as this definition. So again, whenever you see that you work a lot over definitions, ask yourself why. Why do you need to define things here? You could say, yeah, because the concept is not clear. Right. But then establish the concept. This would be your work, and this would make you moving from descriptive writing, summarizing, towards analytical writing. If you compare 2 or 3 literature sources and then establish how the term behavior in the context of energy-related behaviors might be understood, then this is moving you towards critical analytical writing. So how can you test yourself? You could open your current draft and use a search function and looking for terms such as definition, defines, and the author says. As more often as you see and find those terms, as more your draft is still at the beginning stage. So that's quite objectively doable to test where are you in your writing. Now, what is an example for critical analytical writing? It is painful, it is slow, it is specific, it's evidence-based, and it uses a lot of references. Now, let's look into this example. It's the same thesis work, which is by the way the work of Anna, who is also in the room. So if you have questions on how the development went, she certainly still will recall. Now it goes, energy savings behaviors can be distinguished. So you take here already a distinction between efficiency and curtailment behaviors. Efficiency behaviors are infrequent, one-off type of behaviors which often entail an investment such as loft or cavity wall insulation or buying an energy efficient air conditioner. And now you see there are 1, 2, 3 literature resources that have been consulted to just put this argument together, followed by the next argument that curtailment behaviors in contrary, so you take a position in here, are those that must be performed frequently involving repetitive efforts to reduce energy and so further. And again, you see 1, 2, 3 different sources that have been consulted. And now comes a comparison in between the first argument and the second argument, which goes, each of these 2 groups require different levels of investment. So you do something with the information you have been providing. So you go way beyond just summarizing and describing, because you first have shown 2 different positions, and then you say, what is the difference in there? So this is the analytical part you have been moving into. And again, how can you assess if you are already more on the critical analytical writing? You could use your search function again and look in your drafts for words such as contrary, however, despite, everything that will ask for looking at different positions and comparing things. So as more as you see those terms in your writing, as more critical and analytical, potentially it will be. Did that make sense? Any questions? No? Okay. Understand that there will be old and less skilled writing sitting next to new and shiny writing, including in your very own thesis. Now, what does that mean? That means that a thesis emerges slowly. You start writing things up, you tell how things work. Now let's look into this example, which, if you look at the color code, is yellow highlighted for just summarizing. Significance of theme in qualitative content and themes analysis. Theme is the main product of data analysis that yields practical results in the field of study. The definitions, similarities, and differences of qualitative content analysis and thematic analysis have been defined. According to Weismoradi et al. Study, there are many similarities between. Now, you see, you're just telling again what is qualitative content and thematic analysis. Now, you do this as you start your research because you need to get that understanding. However, parts of that will still continue to be in the final version of the thesis. Those parts that are of relevance for you to put together the context information to show where you are coming from and where you are going to. But it will be greatly reduced in the number of scope, and it will sit next to the critical and analytical parts that you brought in perhaps 2 or 3 years later. So understand, it's absolutely normal that old writing sits next to new writing. Now, again, we have here an example of a description of a process, which is a reporting part. So we are already one step further than just summarizing. Briefly, in this phase of data analysis, researchers reflect on the process of organizing codes and compare them in terms of similarities and differences and so further. So you're reporting here about a process, the process of organizing codes and to compare them. Now, and this is a part that you would find perhaps later in the methodology chapter to be still used, or you might have moved it into your data and analysis chapters because you just need the information ad hoc there to describe what you have been doing and to ground yourself on the process of how organizing codes and comparison goes. So in that case, this older writing will sit next to the data presentation, which is in your part of your thesis. As you go along, writing will become more critical. And here, as in the example, we provide a contrasting view of a topic. Qualitative methods are widely used in learning and teaching research and scholarship, while the epistemologies and theoretical assumptions can be unfamiliar and sometimes challenging to those from, for example, science and engineering's background. There is a wide appreciation and so further. And then more and more it is recognized that clear guidance is needed and so further. So you're comparing here different approaches and have a contrasting view of a topic. This is perhaps writing that you will have been doing into year 2 or 3 of your research. And again, there will be some context information that positions that writing, which is a reporting that we have seen earlier, which is a result of earlier summarizing. So as you go along, your work matures, but parts of the earlier writing will still stay in your thesis. And the same goes for any thesis that you are looking at, and having the understanding and clarity to see, okay, this part of writing of that scholar was certainly from the beginning, but I see here this part is from a later stage because it's much more critical. Now, once you have that notion, it's much easier to identify and follow best practice and to understand what's coming at what point in the research journey. Now, an example of getting familiar with a topic. And if you look through that example, it still shows disconnected paragraphs. That means that it doesn't build on each of the previous sentence. In this case, for example, however, Lakhani and von Hippel pointed out that these 3 motivations do not suffice to explain the motivations to perform mundane but necessary tasks in open source projects, such as providing field support, which is provision to help to people having problems with an open source software product. Now, in this case, where you also can see that this is either early writing or bad writing, is as referred to. And we will come to that later again more in detail, but as referred to just means you didn't take care to look into the original source. So therefore, you work over secondary sources and have not had access to the original study. And this should be avoided by any means. And you also see here that the argument goes still more over conclusions, but not evidence. And we will come into that later too, that's very different if you just build on the conclusion. For example, Smith said, eating too much candies makes you ill, and you just pick on that. Eating too much candies makes you ill. But why? And what is too much? And who was looked at? And what means ill? Now, those are the information that you need to draw on. And this is the evidence level that you need to look into. Elsewise, if you just argue over the conclusions, that's superficial. You can't really be critical, analytic, if that makes sense. And you see the same old writing as it emerges further. So some parts of the initial old reporting style have been remained. Some mistakes have been fixed. If you see the year 2003 now, previously it was 2002, so there was a reference wrongly stated. But more importantly, you have now the new analytical writing, which comes in green, which sits next to the initial part, which still in parts is in there, but largely reduced. So this is a normal process to happen at your own thesis, but also within any other works that you're looking into. And even any paper or any publication is something that has been built on and modified and improved. So there's always older writing that is blended in with newer writing in any type of publications that you get across. Are there any questions towards old versus new? Okay, then we will learn a bit about reading the literature with a problem and not a solution focus. Now, you can do the test and check if your writing has a clear problem focus. If it has a problem focus, it will very much work over negatives. Anything that's broken, anything that you do not want to be like it is. Let's look into this example. You see here, humans hold a limited capacity for worrying. Limited capacity is negative, worrying is negative. They have a finite pool of worry. Worry is negative. They are near-term threats, clearly negative. Greater urgency, potentially negative. Future problems, clearly negative. Not to immediately react to threats, clearly looking onto something negative. Balancing long-range worries, negative. Immediate concerns, negative. One of the barriers to motivate, barriers are negative. In addition is a comparative word now, but brings in avoid losses. So again, the focus lays on the negative, threatened, inaction, greater threats. Now, all of those things are a clear indicator that this is a problem-focused work. And this is what research should be doing, because we work over research problems, not research solutions. So a problem focus basically means to look at what is not working, what is broken, what is unwanted, what is limiting, all things that you won't like them to be. And if you see that in your writing, then this is encouraging for you to have a problem focus in place. If not, it might mean that you're still focusing on the solutions. And we can see in this coming example that the development of your research will go a very different way down depending on whether you have a solution or a problem focus in place. Now let's look into this example. The context is, according to the university mission statement, the university seeks to provide students with a safe, healthy learning environment. Therefore, dormitories are one important aspect of that learning environment. Students spend 55% in their campus dorms and spend a significant amount of working time in the dorm rooms. Okay, so this is a starting point. Now, the problem statement that has been constructed goes as follows. The students' dorms currently do not have air-conditioned units. And during the hot seasons, it is common for room temperatures to exceed 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Many students report that they are unable to do homework in their dorm rooms. So that's clearly unwanted and shows an issue at place. Others report having problems sleeping because of the humidity and temperature. Again, something that shouldn't be the case. The rooms are unhealthy and inhibit students' productivity and academic achievement. So that's the bottom line of the problem. Now, I could ask a solution-focused or a problem-focused research question. If I ask a solution-focused question, then I would ask, how can we making the dorms more hospitable? While if I look into the problem, then I would ask, why are there no air conditionings in the dorms in the first place? And depending on the question, the research purpose will be very different. If we have a solution focus, we will be focusing on how to make the dorms more hospitable. hospitable. So we will investigate into options for purchasing air conditions and the different types of air conditionings. We will look at ways to mitigate the problem. So everything that could be done to resolve. Contrary to that, if we look at the problem end, we would ask, why are there no air conditionings? So we would want to understand, why haven't they been installed thus far? Why haven't they been purchased? What are the reasons that have that prevented to happen? And consequently, the research outcome also is very different. If we just speculate for reasons on how we could get something, then the outcome will be based on random guesses and uncertainty on whether or not all options have been considered. While if we have a problem-focused work, we will have a clear understanding of the situations and why no air conditionings have been put in place. And this will provide us with the knowledge required to understand can or cannot be a solution found. Are there ways to mitigate the issues, right? And obviously, if you read the literature with a solution focus, you would just read it with a view on more hospitable. This is what you would ask Google or your search engine of choice. How can we make dorm rooms more hospitable? How can we finance air conditions? What are the financing plans? So whatever comes to your mind, but that's not how research should work. If you would consult the literature with a clear problem focus, you would exactly, first of all, take the initial observation, why aren't there air conditionings? And then you would look into the literature on what prevents universities or other organizations to install air conditionings, right? And this will put your research down a very different lane, and also your literature review and the data analysis and the discussion chapters would be very different. Was that clear? The problem versus solution? Right, then let's look into how to draw and compare evidence and data and not only conclusions. Let's look at an example evidence-based argument. And this argument is from the University of Leeds, I think. The source is down and it's publicly available to you. By the way, all of the sources are noted on each of the slides, so for you to look them up if you wish to. So there are a number of inherent methodological difficulties in evaluating treatment efficacy in this area, and this has contributed to controversy within the research literature surrounding treatment outcomes for this group of offenders. And now if you see, after the writer has established the key terms, group and offenders, these are used consistently through the text. And this is also something that you can look at your draft to find out very objectively. How evidence-based is your argument? You first identify what are your key terms, what is the key evidence. Do I talk about groups? Do I talk about offenders? And then you do a search through your document, how often you use those words and in which context. And this, by the way, is something you should be doing for your entire thesis. Have a list with your key terms and understand where and how you use them. We have a webinar that was dedicated to that subject, which is called mirroring, like the mirror. And there you can get much more information on how to assure that you have a consistency through your thesis and that you make a good use of your key terms. So if you don't have a list of your key terms, consider putting one together. Now, we earlier already said that as referenced in is a bad idea and a bad example to do. If you don't access the original study and just say, yeah, Smith said that in Thomason stood, yeah, how do you know? Drawing on conclusions is not only dangerous, it is like the kids' silent post game. That's how we call it in Germany. In the US, it's a telephone game. In the UK, it's a Chinese whisperer game. But the result is the same. You see, if you start with red roses with thorny stem, you might end up with red houses, Miss Moneylands. So if you do not look into the data and evidence yourself, you do not know whether or not the conclusions that have been reached are accurate, if you agree with them, if you can also produce them, if you would run that experiment again. So for all of that, you need that level of detail, which again makes the writing process much more time consuming, but this is the way it goes. Because conclusions were made in a context and used by other researchers in another context. And now you want to use them within your context. So it's already exactly 3 lanes down. And therefore, you need to look into the initial piece of work, or at least you should be recommended doing so. If you think it's not worth it, then ask yourself, is it worth it to use that work? Yeah. And this again is why initial writing works over summarizing, because at that point it's acceptable. At that point, you might still do not look into the original source because you do not know, would that anyway be of relevance? So obviously, you cannot do that work for all literature sources or any piece that you read. But for those that are relevant, that you're building on, you should go that extra mile. So you should have, for those key literature sources, a clear understanding, how have the conclusions been reached? Under what conditions have they been reached? How well does the data support the different arguments? And what were the different arguments? If you have clarity about that, then that can also support you in your critical analysis once you draw on that literature and do something with it. Now, conclusions are obviously drawn at the end. For any research project and any scientific discipline, drawing conclusions is a final and most important part of the process. Whichever reasoning processes and research methods were used, the final conclusion is critical, determining success or failure. So you could have an excellent experiment, but if you do not put enough effort into drawing the conclusions, the work will not be taken seriously and it might fail. Now, weak conclusion is not only the conclusion itself that is weak, but it's exactly how the argument, the analysis process, the drawing up of the conclusion all comes together. So it must be a robust and well-designed process of the research itself. Right? And having said that, the word "and" here is a relative one. If we talk about putting your thesis together, then even after the conclusion, there will be a lot of work to be done, such as revisiting the research question, like is it the question or is it the answer that didn't fit? You have a conclusion, but perhaps the question and the conclusion do not match, which means you would need to go back to the question and see, has the question went faulty? And then perhaps adapt the question rather than working over changing the conclusion. And that might mean you also perhaps will need to go back to the literature review. And it might mean you need to adapt the narrative. And that might also imply to adapt and update the introduction chapter and the abstract. Now that can be a whole process that after reaching the conclusion might still be initiated. And we have been seeing theses either prior or after the viva that had to undergo 1 or 2 years of being amended. So, as we come to the end, understand how to critically reflect on and how to challenge conclusions that are put forward in the literature. We have here 3 examples that we will put out. Example A is from the University of Cumbria. So let's look into that. Brown maintains that leadership is an essential quality in nursing. This is confirmed by the recent requirements of the NHS plan. This plan has emphasized the importance of introducing the transformational models of leadership. Smith explains that this is a leadership which involves the use of charisma and interpersonal skills to enable achievement. Jones argues that the key characteristic of transformational leadership is empowering others to achieve. In my own experience, a leader with transformational qualities can make any team member feel that they have a useful part to play in the organization. This is confirmed by Fear, who argues that transformational leaders increases feelings of self-worth and capability in their team members. Now, which type of writing is this? Let's look into this. Is this piece an example of good academic writing? Well, the style is formal and it flows well. It's used to introduce evidence from the literature. So how well does it use the literature to back up the statements being made? The literature is used to make a number of points. An attempt is made to find answers in the literature. However, each citation is not really explored or interpreted by the student. So it's just presented as a statement. Let's look into that. Brown maintains that leadership is. So that's just a statement, right? So to what extent is it reflected? There is some reflection on the part of the students, and answers from the literature are used to confirm these findings. This student does not go far enough in trying to explain, justify these feelings on the negative side. And as a fourth feedback, to what extent is it analytical and critical? There is an attempt to analyze the topic, but this is not done in great depth. The student does not question, evaluate the evidence from the literature, and therefore shows limited critical thinking. Now, this type of feedback you could be getting in your Viva or in the written examination of your thesis, where examiners will exactly work through your writing and make this type of comments where they think the work resonates well, or it might fall short. And obviously this type, example A, is still a very initial writing draft, or at least it's not up to the standards that one would expect for a final doctoral thesis. All right, so this is how it looks highlighted in colors. The green is calling on own experiences, and then the blue is using literature in support of a simple 1 + 1 = 2 statement without any critical reflection. And in my own experience, yeah, so is your experience, but which evidence, which data? Yeah, you would need to bring that in and not just throw it out like there. This is a sort of lukewarm argument. Now, contrary, this example, already if you look at it, it looks much more robust. It's a critical review of Goodwin et al. Decision-making in Singapore and Australia, the influence of culture on accountants' ethical decisions. And it was also published in a journal. So there will have gone a lot of work into it. I will not read it in detail, but go more to the evaluation. Now, it has a clear title and bibliographic details of the text, a critical review of Goodwin et al. It has a clear introduction that says and shows where you're coming from using Hofstade's, and it has clear reporting verbs in place. Goodwin et al. Conducted a study. It presents the aim and purpose of the article and the key findings. This research aimed to sentence themes focus on the text. The study reveals that responded differently to the ethical dilemmas. There are transition signals that provide structure and coherence, like however the results of the other, so comparative view. There's a reviewer's careful judgment to the extent that this research is exploratory, and the conclusion summarizes the reviewer's judgment. In summary, it has to be admitted that the current study is, so it shows carefulness, modality used to express certainty and limit overgeneralizing, still far from being conclusive. It offers recommendations. Further studies must be undertaken. It is concessive clauses assist in expressing a mixed response despite some deficiencies in the methodology. And it qualifies reviewer's judgment to the extent that this review is exploratory, in example, trying to investigate. Now, there will have gone a lot of time into just putting this writing together, and that is clearly visible and also acknowledged in the evaluation of the text. So this is certainly a level that you would want to reach eventually, at least in the more mature parts of your thesis. also understanding that this example comes from a journal publication. Now, a final example from the University of Leicester. There are a number of inherent methodological difficulties in evaluating treatment efficacy in this area, and this has contributed to controversy within the research literature surrounding treatment outcomes for this group of offenders. Firstly, while there's no doubt that the primary criterion of treatment success is a reduction in the rate of reoffending, reconviction data does not in isolation provide a realistic representation of actual levels of reoffending by this group. It is well established that there is a discrepancy between reoffending and reconviction rates. The latter underestimating the number of offenses committed. Indeed, a significant proportion of offenses committed by offenders are either unreported or do not result in the offender being reported. Now, if we look at it using color code, then the green parts show what the study is about. The dark green part show where it is from. The bluish one shows what it is looked at. And the yellow parts show what can be observed. So this is a fairly connected and comprehensive and well-written piece. And this is something that you again can check for yourself in your thesis document. How well is your text adding up? Are you critically engaging in analysis? And do you have a focus established? Do you tell what it is about? And do you work with data and evidence? Right, if you would want to train that ability of engaging in critical analytics a bit further, you might want to take a look at this course, which is available for free self-study with peer support or fully tutored and also with on-demand feedback. This is for those that are already at an advanced research stage. Those at earlier research stages, for example, thesis proposal stage or year one of their doctorate journey, you might want to check the course on issue identification, problematizing, and research question framing. So to get clarity at that level first, and from there embark on the critical analytical skills development. And you're also welcome to take a look at our research write-up clubs. The clubs have been just released recently, like 2-3 months ago. So they are still very much in development, but you're welcome to look into there, and there will be discussion sessions available for you to ask any questions that you might have. And with this, we go off the record and open the floor for any discussion or follow-on questions that you might have. Let me stop the recording.